Why did you do it, Lou? He hissed, the intensity of his tone reverberating throughout the refurbished hallway. He was pacing along the unvarying kitchen tiles, clasping the phone in his clammy hand. The grip he had on it ceased to prove how frustrated he was. Why did you fucking do it? He was furious. Actually, that was an understatement. He'd barely slept in days, deprived of the rest because he couldn't get the image of his brother in some cell out of his head. And yet, here his brother was, making light out of the entire situation, like always. Lou snorted in response, his laughter barely audible over the rustling in the background. Do what? You know exactly what, he snapped, the corners of his mouth frothing in anger. You shouldn't have taken the blame. I was the one who... Jeffy, Lou interrupted, smirking as the younger boy huffed in response, his attention diverting to his abraded fingernails. You really think I let my little brother get locked up in a place like this? It's fucking awful in here. And besides, you're already a bit psycho. I don't need you going all batshit crazy on me. He laughed dryly at his own statement, his tone devoid of any enthusiasm. He knew himself how sensitive Jeffrey was. He would never have coped in juvie. It would have broken. I don't care, Lou. I really don't fucking care. It should be me in there, not you. He advanced towards the window, pressing the edge of his hand against the pellucid glass before glancing outside the children. Their limbs moved chaotically as they blasted each other with super soakers, a stark contrast to the enervated mood he was enduring himself. I don't know what to say. His brother sighed, cutting off his exasperated tirade. Don't mention it, Jeffy. We're brothers. Lou? Jeffrey whispered, his pupils dilating in consternation. His strangled breaths of horror were the only sound audible in the hallway as he turned around, taking tentative steps backwards and closing the distance between his fabric pullover and the wallpaper. This wasn't a trick of his imagination. He'd seen the reflection in the glass. No. Jeffrey? What's going on? Lou's voice pitched in alarm, the static ringing in his ears. Jeffrey wanted to say something, anything, but he'd forgotten how to form words. Jeffrey, answer the goddamn fucking phone. Randy's boots scraped along the flooring, followed by the resonant footfalls of Keith and Troy. His impenetrable eyes were filled with malice as he drew nearer, registering the fearful expression etched across Jeffrey's features. It empowered him. Looks like we need to fix this loose end, boys. Randy smirked, groveling his fist towards the lowered cell phone and knocking it to the ground. Jeffrey's hands balled into fists, averting his gaze to the floor, his palms concealed with the confines of his sleeves. Who's first, then? Jeffy? His brother's voice echoed from the small device. Who the fuck is that? I swear, if you touch my fucking bro. Troy snickered, shooting Jeffrey a complacent look before depressing his foot onto the phone, splintering the screen into minuscule shards. Randy simpered in approval, hunching down to pick it up before sliding it into his pocket, emitting a malevolent chuckle before gesturing his cronies to surround Jeffrey's huddled form. This was not happening. He was not about to relive that point in time. Not now. Not ever. After the incident, he became obsessed with finding an answer, trying to come up with some excuse to justify why they did what they did to him. But no matter how hard he tried, he could never find a solution. There was no excuse. They didn't intend for him to live through the ordeal. That had been their plan all along. That's why, as he lay half-conscious on the kitchen floor, they took turns pouring bleach and vodka over his body. They were cowards. They'd waited until he was at a disadvantage and couldn't defend himself. For weeks, he lay in that stale hospital room, bedridden and in agony. reliving the day over and over again, hyperventilating every time the flame was reignited, screams filling the air as parents desperately tried to put the fire out, but all he could see was their chilling faces, laughing at his torment. Eventually, the nightmare started to become less, overruled by that voice in his head, telling him to see his new appearance. No matter how much he pleaded, the nurses would never let him. He needed to heal. That's all they kept telling him. He took it into his own hands one night when he was in the bathroom, tearing the bandages from his face, seeing the damage they had caused for the first time. That was the point he'd finally snapped, the remainder of his sanity gone. That night, Jeff the Killer was born. Give up yet? He menacingly glared into the faces of the bullies stood nearby, the delineation of their forms creating a perilous shadow which arched across the walls. He felt smothered in their presence. By how they invaded his personal space, his mind was racing, ominous thoughts spurring. He wanted to kill them, to reenact revenge for all of the shit they had caused. He couldn't quite remember what happened. Besides the impact of something colliding with his head, it hit him so hard his visions morphed into two perspectives. Breathing heavily, he moved his hand, eyebrows furrowed in confusion. Why were his clothes soaking wet? Looking around him, he noticed there was more liquid on the linoleum floor, the stale stench of vodka and bleach penetrating his nostrils. "What's the matter, Jeffy?" Randy smirked, waving the battered phone in his face, devilment etched across his features. "Did we fuck your phone up?" Jeffrey lunged forward in a desperate bid to grab the phone, which only spurred Keith to extend an eczema-ridden hand and shove him back onto the floor, his body resembling that of a rag doll as he slouched against the cabinet. They were really testing his limits. Nobody used that nickname besides you and his brother. Two significant, important people in his life. Did they honestly believe they could get away with mocking the people he loved? He attempted to get up again, scraping his braided nails against the wallpaper for support, but miserably failed, resulting in laughter from notorious bullies. "What's so fucking funny?" he snapped, consumed by fury. "What's funny?" Keith snickered in a manner, cocking his head to the side in amusement. "What's funny, Jeff, is that you're covered in bleach and alcohol." Randy, the tallest of the three, smirked as he delved in his pockets for a lighter. The incandescent flames danced in the air as he sparked the lighter, foreshadowing the ominous words that had been spoken beforehand. In that instant, he kindled the pool of flammable liquid, igniting it alongside Jeffrey and the remainder of his sanity. "No!" His screams intensified as he stumbled backwards, the laces from his boots making him trip over, smacking the side of his head against the concrete wall. Although his nerve endings were damaged, he still felt it. He steadied himself, panting hysterically as he brushed imaginary flames from his body, desperately trying to put them out. It took him a second to realize they didn't exist, that there was no fire. Since that day, he'd been petrified of the sight, being one of his very few phobias. Fire affected him the same way water affected Ben. Brushing the strands of unkempt hair from his sweaty forehead, he frowned, though it was hindered by the wounds in his cheeks. He could never express sadness, not with this permanent smile etched across his face. "What's the matter, Jeffy? Scared?" He had to ignore his other side. He simply wouldn't give in, no matter what the cost. Slowly composing himself, he deflected his attention towards the gaudy curtains before he registered a slender pair of arms wrapping around his waist. A dazzling charm bracelet clasped the individual's wrists, sliding down their forearm as he attempted to engulf him with warmth and comfort. "They were your arms. Don't touch me." He spat the words like venom, emphasizing each word clearly and grabbing your slender wrist between his fingertips. He longed for it. He virtually craved it, but that only served to display weakness. His cerulean orbs swiveled away from your gaze as he deflected his gaze towards the ceiling, primarily so that he didn't have to witness the hurt expression etched across your features. He didn't want to destroy the only person he loved. His chest distended as he expressed a growl of vexation, entwining the split ends of his hair through his fingertips. He trudged towards the wardrobe, his charred hands clenching the burnished handle. Tears threatened to stream down his incinerated cheeks as the heavy door swung open. It was assembled exactly the same as before, with loose favorite clothes folded sprucely above the drawers, along with the jumpers coordinated on plastic hangers. The cobwebs illuminating the corners and the fine layer of dust coating the fabric. It was difficult to discern whether time had passed at all. He momentarily oscillated his neck to the side before his orbs focused on something reflecting in the mirror. He took slow, vigilant steps backwards, his lidless orbs narrowing when the figure mirrored his action. Curses expelled from his chapped lips as he backed into the wall, digging his nails into the calloused palms of his hands. It was that moment he realized the grotesque, malformed figure in the mirror belonged to him. Snarling, he looked away, averting his gaze towards the textured rug on the floor. This had been the first time he'd looked in a mirror since he permanently disfigured his face. You made me into a fucking monster. Come on, it's not like I have arms now, is it, Jeffrey? So you and I both know that's fucking bullshit. Antagonistically, he turned back towards the mirror, mentally preparing himself for the hideous sight he was about to face. In the days that followed after the incident, he yearned to love himself again, to simply feel normal. But in his crazy delusional world, nothing was normal. For years, he avoided anything that showed his reflection, mirrors, windows, everything. He knew if he saw himself, he'd despise his face just as much as his mother did. That was why he tried to make himself beautiful. He wanted his parents to think the same, because they were even more traumatized. All he wanted was to smile, because if he didn't, he'd given up. So that's why he permanently smiled, so he didn't have to force it on a daily basis. Some days, he wondered why you stayed with him, questioning if you still loved him beyond his disfigured appearance, or if you stayed because he made you. Sighing heavily, he stared at himself, tracing the lacerations edging upwards from the corners of his mouth over his cheeks, blood staining his fingertips crimson. The way he had cut them made them appear jagged, not symmetrical, but personalized, noticeably self-inflicted. You're making this even worse than it has to be, Jeffy. You never wanted to stop smiling. You said it yourself. That's funny, 'cause I have nothing to fucking smile about. Again with the self-pity. How original. You're really starting to bore me. Is it any wonder why you've got a face only a mother could love? Oh wait, she didn't. He growled lightly, warning his dissociative identity to shut up before it really tested his patience. He wasn't in the mood for its sick puns. Cocking his head to the side, he watched himself closely, analyzing, searching for something to feel good about. But the more he looked, the more agitated he became. Headlights from cars spurring past illuminated the dull room, radiating the wretched, bleached complexion of his skin. The texture was smooth beneath his fingers, but parts of it were still coarse, having never been moisturized since the incident. Those cold blue eyes followed his every action, mirroring him, eyes which were rimmed by the disintegrated remains of lids, creating the illusion that he was wearing liner. It made him smirk, remembering your reaction when you realized that night in the garden. He guessed his appearance terrified his victims, and he got off on that. He thrived on it. Narrowing his orbs, he looked closer, the slightest change occurring in his irises. They looked bluer, more doleful, not like his at all. They were... No, he was an idiot for even thinking that. You still don't get it, do you? Are you really that fucking stupid that I have to spell it out for you? It can't be. That's not possible. Really? 'Cause I could have sworn he looked awfully familiar. His breathing hitched as his face began to morph, resembling that of his brother's. The cinnamon tresses of loose curls, which hadn't been straightened, replacing his own hair. Flawless, perfect, even skin glowing with a sun-kissed radiance. He felt himself convulsing, limbs shaking. This wasn't real. His mind was messing with him. Out of reaction, he slammed his fist into the mirror, the shards of glass fragmenting to smithereens around his combat boots, and along with it, his reflection. Do you miss him, Jeffy? Is that it? Are you still trying to convince yourself you'll get him fucking back? Get out of my head. You've already disappointed enough people throughout your life. You realize that? You killed him, Jeffrey. You killed him. He felt the black mist swirl at the corner of his mind as his heart thrashed vigorously within the confines of his rib cage. He was standing above Lou's sleeping form, the silent sound of his breaths lingering in the silence. He looked so peaceful, so happy. He wanted him to stay like that. He needed to protect him from his shit-awful world before it destroyed him too. Rigidly, his arm ascended into the dark, the blade glistening in the moonlight. It screamed with such viciousness. He knew what kind of damage it would do. He kept trying to convince himself to stop himself from what he was about to do, but he couldn't. The voice wouldn't let him. He scrunched his eyes shut as the knife thrust downwards, his brother's cries gripping his insides in a tormented knot as he continually stabbed him. Unable to watch as he gave up fighting, accepting his fate, he was killing him over and over again, just like the nightmares that consumed him every night. He plummeted to the ground, his knees grazing the glass which cut through the fabric of his skinnies. But he couldn't feel it. He could barely feel anything, besides the numb, broken realization of what he had done. The tears cascaded down his cheeks as he sat there, arms swaying heavily by his sides. He couldn't control the sobs as they vibrated through his chest, crying loudly in the night like a man who had just been stripped of his dignity. He never expressed how he was feeling. The only emotion he had come to know was anger. But now his feelings are spiraling out of control. He was a killer, a broken, sad, tormented one with a story nobody understood. No one cared to read between the lines to put the pieces together, to understand why he had become who he was today. He had been a scared, lonely little boy driven to the edge by his bullies, and nobody would ever know. Nobody would ever hear his story. Are you going to admit what you wanted now? He glimpsed into the remainder of the mirror, his sobs growing louder as he stared at his reflection, blinded by the tears. I wanted my brother. Your brother. What a shame. Too bad you killed. A gasp resounded from behind his hunched form, permeating the ominous silence. Your charm bracelets jingled rhythmically as the figure slid a gloved hand around your chin, preventing you from screaming ardently about the situation. Another figure loitered close by, the slightest flash of yellow discernible in the dingy lighting. Jeff glanced over his shoulder, noticing the slightest trace of a harlequin mask peering out from beneath the figure's hood. Sockets as dark as the night staring directly at him, enticing him to react. He felt the anger vibrate through his limbs, knowing this was not who he wanted it to be, but still hoping. Lou? The figure's boots scraped against the parquet flooring as he emitted a low chuckle, dragging you along with him as he laughed bitterly. You with me, sunshine?